My stepsister revealed her pregnancy at my rehearsal dinner. I told my brother the baby wasn't his. When my stepsister stood up during my toast and announced she was carrying my brother's child, I set my wine glass down so carefully that nobody noticed my hand was shaking. Because I already knew the math didn't work, and I already knew what I was going to have to do about it. 24 hours before my own wedding, I was about to become the villain of my stepsister's pregnancy announcement, and I hadn't even said I do yet. My name is Josephine, though everyone calls me Jo, and the rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant my fiancé Callan and I had saved for 8 months to afford. String lights over a private patio. 40 of our closest people gathered to celebrate the wedding happening the next evening. My younger brother Desmond had married his wife's sister 2 years earlier in a whirlwind that surprised everyone. And my stepsister Inez had been part of our blended family since I was 14, when our parents married and suddenly I had a sister I never asked for, and, over the years, grew to genuinely love. Inez had always had a gift for timing that wasn't accidental, a way of making sure the biggest news in any room belonged to her. And I'd watched her pull this trick since we were teenagers, small at first, showing up late to my 16th birthday with a new boyfriend nobody had met, growing bigger over the years until it became a kind of family legend nobody quite laughed about anymore. I told myself this dinner would be different, because it was my wedding, because surely even Inez understood there were limits. She arrived 20 minutes late in a fitted emerald dress that left no question about the shape underneath it, one hand resting against her stomach the entire walk to the table, and my brother Desmond trailed a step behind her, looking dazed in the specific way men look when they've just found out they're about to be fathers. I hugged her at the door, and she held on a beat too long, whispering that she had the most incredible news and couldn't wait for the perfect moment to share it. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself she just meant she was excited for my wedding. About 40 minutes into dinner, right as Callan's best man Rutger stood to deliver his toast to us, Inez rose from her seat instead, tapping her champagne flute with a fork hard enough that the sound cut through every conversation on the patio. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," she said, glowing under the string lights. "But Desmond and I can't wait one more second, and we wanted our whole family here together when we said it." My stomach dropped before she even finished the sentence, because I'd done a mental calendar the moment I saw that dress, and something about the timeline felt wrong in a way I couldn't yet name. "We're having a baby," Inez announced, and the patio exploded into gasps and clapping, chairs scraping back as relatives rushed toward her and Desmond in a wave that swallowed the entire rehearsal dinner in under a minute. My mother reached them first, pulling Inez into a careful hug, already crying. My father was shaking Desmond's hand like he'd won something, and I sat there at the head of the table in my rehearsal dinner dress, watching my own wedding weekend get rebranded into a pregnancy announcement, exactly the way my engagement had once nearly gotten swallowed by something similar with a cousin. Except this time it wasn't a date being stolen. It was the whole spotlight, 24 hours before I needed it most. "Can this wait until tomorrow?" I said, and my voice came out sharper than I meant it to, sharp enough that every head on that patio swung back toward me instead. The silence that followed had teeth in it. My mother's face slid from joy into something disapproving so fast it looked rehearsed. Inez's hand flew to her chest, eyes filling instantly, the way a woman cries when she's already planned for the tears to be useful. "I'm sorry, Jo," she said, voice wobbling. "We just got so excited, and I thought since it's a family weekend anyway, everyone being together felt like the right moment." I told her this was my rehearsal dinner that I got one night before my wedding, and she'd taken it, and my mother cut across the table telling me not to make a scene, that Inez was pregnant and emotional, and there was no reason to be jealous of good news. Nobody at that table took my side, not my father, not my aunt, not even Callan's mother, who I barely knew but who still managed a disapproving look in my direction. I let it go because there was nothing else to do with 20 pairs of eyes already deciding I was the problem. That night, lying awake in the hotel room with Callan, I ran the numbers again in my head. Desmond and Inez had gotten married 14 months earlier, and Inez had spent the last several months constantly traveling for what she called consulting work, gone for a week or two at a time, coming home tired and vague about the details. If she was announcing a pregnancy now and claiming she was already 12 weeks along, that put conception right in the middle of a trip she'd taken alone to a conference in another state. A trip I remembered specifically because Desmond had complained about being lonely that whole week. "You're doing math you don't want to be doing," Callan said quietly, watching my face in the dark. I told him I couldn't stop, that something about the timeline felt wrong, that Inez had always had a talent for making sure the family never looked too closely at the details behind her big moments. He didn't tell me I was being paranoid, which I appreciated, but he didn't tell me I was right either. He just held my hand and told me to get some sleep before my own wedding, and I tried, and mostly failed. The wedding happened the next day anyway, because I refused to let Inez take that from me too, and it was, despite everything, beautiful. Desmond gave a warm, slightly tearful speech at the reception about how proud he was of his big sister, and Inez sat glowing at the family table, with a hand perpetually resting on her stomach, soaking in congratulations from relatives who kept detouring past her chair on their way to congratulate us. I danced with my new husband and told myself the timeline thing was nothing, that I was letting old resentment poison a happy day. 3 weeks after the honeymoon, my mother hosted a family dinner to celebrate both the wedding and the pregnancy together, and Inez arrived glowing, already showing more than I expected for what she claimed was 14 weeks. She hugged me tightly at the door and said she'd been so worried, things felt tense between us, that she hated the idea of anything coming between sisters, especially now. I told her we were fine. I watched her the entire meal the way you watch a door you're not sure is locked. Her phone stayed face down on the table throughout dinner, and every few minutes her eyes dropped to it, thumbs moving fast under the tablecloth, a small private smile crossing her face before she slid back into conversation like nothing had happened. When my father asked which doctor she was seeing, she named a clinic 2 counties away, further than any obstetrician we knew, and changed the subject before he could ask why. When my aunt reached to feel a kick, Inez laughed and pulled back, saying the baby was shy and only performed for her. Twice during dinner, her phone buzzed and she excused herself to take the call in the hallway, taking her purse with her both times, strange for someone stepping 10 feet away. The second time, I waited 2 minutes and followed under the excuse of getting water, and stopped in the kitchen doorway when I heard her voice through the cracked hall door, low and careful in a tone I'd never heard her use with Desmond. "I know," she was saying. "I know it's close, but the dates work if nobody looks too hard. Just tell him you'll be careful about when you post anything." A pause. "He can't find out before she's born, Farhan. Not now, not after everything." Farhan. I stood frozen in that kitchen with a glass of water going warm in my hand, turning the name over like a stone I'd found in my shoe. I had never once heard my stepsister mention anyone named Farhan in 14 months of marriage to my brother. I slipped back to the table before she caught me and sat through dessert smiling and nodding while my mind raced through every strange detail of the last month. The conference trip, the faraway doctor, the refusal to let anyone near her stomach, the private smile at a phone that clearly wasn't texting my brother. That night I told Callan everything, and he was quiet for a long time before he said what I already feared. "If there's a man named Farhan involved in whether or when Desmond finds out about this baby," he said, "that's not innocent Joe. That's someone managing a secret, not celebrating a pregnancy." I couldn't accuse her on the strength of one overheard phone call. Inez was too skilled at flipping a room, too practiced at turning tears into ammunition, and I'd already watched her do exactly that at my own rehearsal dinner, in front of everyone I loved. I needed proof, something with a name and a face attached, something she couldn't cry her way out of in front of my mother. I hired a private investigator named Odalis Ferreira, a former insurance fraud examiner with 14 years of experience before going independent, recommended by a coworker who'd used her during a contested custody case. Odalis listened to everything: the conference trip, the far-off clinic, the name Farhan, the refusal to let anyone touch her stomach, and told me it sounded less like paranoia and more like a woman managing 2 timelines at once. She agreed to look into it quietly for 2 weeks. 12 days later, Odalis called and asked me to come to her office. She slid a folder across the desk with a tab labeled in neat block letters and told me to look slowly. Inside were surveillance photographs, time-stamped, showing Inez meeting a man at a coffee shop near the far-off clinic she claimed as her obstetrician's office. Twice within the 2-week window. Always the same corner booth. Always leaving separately. In 2 of the photos, his hand rested against her lower back. His name, according to Odalis's research, was Farhan Qureshi, and he lived 4 blocks from that clinic. "There's something else," Odalis said, tapping a second folder. I pulled the clinic's public business filings out of curiosity, since it seems like an odd choice for someone who lives across the county. It's not an OB practice. It's a fertility and surrogacy consulting office. I made a call under a pretext and confirmed your stepsister has an active file there, but not as a patient carrying her own pregnancy. As an intended parent, working with a surrogate. Her actual conception window, based on standard gestational dating, doesn't match a natural pregnancy with your brother at all. I sat in that office feeling the floor tilt slightly, because the truth Odalis was describing was stranger than an affair, stranger than anything I'd let myself imagine. "Are you telling me the baby isn't even biologically related to Desmond because she used a surrogate?" I asked, and Odalis shook her head slowly. "I'm telling you it's more complicated than that. The intake paperwork lists Farhan Qureshi as the second intended parent, not your brother. This isn't your stepsister carrying your brother's baby through a surrogate. This is your stepsister and another man having a baby together through a surrogate, and letting your brother believe it's his." I called Callan from the parking lot and could barely get the sentence out. He drove straight to meet me and read through the folder page by page, his face going through the same slow-motion collapse mine had in Odalis's office. "She's not even pregnant," he said finally, like the words needed to be spoken aloud to become real. "There's a surrogate somewhere carrying a baby that belongs to her and this other man, and she's going to hand Desmond a child that isn't his, and let him build a whole life believing he's the father." I knew he was right, and I also knew the second I said any of this to my family, Ines would twist it into me being jealous of her happy news, the same story she'd already primed everyone to believe about me at the rehearsal dinner. I needed to hear it from her mouth before I brought it to Desmond. Needed her cornered somewhere she couldn't perform her way out of it with a room full of witnesses ready to defend her. I texted her that I was coming over and needed to talk, and she wrote back instantly asking if everything was okay. The same reflexive concern she'd performed my entire adult life right before doing something that wasn't okay at all. When I arrived, Desmond's car wasn't in the driveway, and I let myself feel a small, cold relief that I wouldn't have to do this in front of him yet. She opened the door already anxious, asking what was wrong. Was it the wedding photos? Was it me? And I walked past her into a living room already staged with a bassinet in the corner and a stack of baby name books on the coffee table. I pulled out my phone, opened the folder of scanned documents Odalys had given me, and held the screen up so she could see the surrogacy intake form first, Farhan Qureshi's name printed clearly beside her own. The color drained from her face in a single visible wave, like watching a light switch flip somewhere behind her eyes. "Who is Farhan?" I said, and my voice didn't shake the way I expected it to. Her mouth opened and closed twice before anything came out. "You had me followed," she whispered. "I hired an investigator," I said. "I have the surrogacy paperwork, the coffee shop photos, the fertility clinic's own records listing him as the second intended parent. I know this baby isn't Desmond's. I know you've been planning to hand him someone else's child and let him believe he made her. Explain it to me, Inez, because right now none of this looks like anything but a lie built to trap my brother forever." She sank onto the arm of the couch, and for a moment the performance dropped entirely, replaced by something rawer than I'd ever seen on her face. "Farhan and I were together before Desmond," she said, the words tumbling out fast now that the dam had broken. "It ended, I thought it ended. And then I married your brother and things were good. They were genuinely good. Until Farhan came back into my life around the time we started trying for a baby, and nothing was working medically on my end. He offered to help, we used a surrogate using his and my genetics because mine alone weren't viable. And it was supposed to just be a solution, not a whole thing." I asked her the only question that mattered. "Were you ever going to tell Desmond the truth?" She didn't answer for a long time, and when she finally did, her voice had gone hollow. "After the baby was born," she said. "Once he held her, once he loved her. I was going to tell him it took help to get her here, and by then it wouldn't matter where the pieces came from, because he'd already be her father in every way that counted. I told her that wasn't protecting him, it was making sure he could never leave once he found out. And something in her face told me she already knew that and simply hadn't let herself look at it directly until I said it out loud." Her fear curdled fast into something colder, the same flip I'd watched happen once before at another family gathering, years earlier, when a different woman had run out of tears and reached for threats instead. She stood and told me if I said one word to Desmond or to our parents, she'd tell everyone I'd hired someone to stalk her out of jealousy over my own wedding getting overshadowed, that I'd never forgiven her for existing in this family, that I was trying to destroy her happiness because I couldn't stand not being the only daughter anymore. I told her I had documentation, timestamps, a clinic's own intake form with her signature on it, and that no performance in the world was going to undo those. I drove home shaking and called Odalys first, who told me calmly that given the deliberate concealment involved in the surrogacy arrangement and the financial commitments Desmond had almost certainly already made toward a child he believed was biologically his, this had moved past a family matter and into something worth consulting a family law attorney about, regardless of what I decided to tell my brother personally. She connected me the next morning with an attorney named Bartholomew Okafor, 22 years in family and reproductive law, who reviewed Odalys's file and confirmed that surrogacy arrangements concealed from a spouse in this way could carry serious legal weight in a future custody or divorce proceeding, especially with clear documentation of intent to deceive. I still hadn't told Desmond anything, and every day that passed felt like a stone in my stomach, because somewhere in his apartment he was picking out crib sheets and reading parenting books, still believing he'd made a daughter with the woman he loved. Callan and I decided together that Desmond deserved to hear it from us before it came from Inez spinning it first. Or worse, from a surrogate's delivery room where the truth would land with no warning at all. We drove to his apartment on a Sunday afternoon, and I brought the folder, the same one that had already broken Inez open on her own couch. Desmond listened without interrupting, the way people listen when a part of them has been quietly bracing for something they can't name. When I got to the surrogacy intake form with Farhan's name printed beside Inez's, his jaw tightened in a way that told me he was doing math on exactly how long this had been happening under his own roof. When I showed him the coffee shop photographs, he went very still, staring at them long enough that I thought he might not say anything at all. "This baby isn't mine," he finally said, not as a question. "She's been planning to hand me another man's child and let me believe I made her." I told him yes, and that a family attorney already understood the shape of what had happened, and that whatever he decided to do next, he deserved to walk into it with his eyes open instead of blind. He drove to the fertility clinic himself the next morning and confirmed everything with a records administrator willing to speak, once he explained the situation and produced his own marriage certificate. And by that afternoon, he'd retained Bartholomew Okafor to begin proceedings that would protect him from any legal claim to fatherhood he never consented to. The surrogate, a young woman named Priyanka who had been kept largely in the dark about the full situation herself, was located through the clinic's own records and, once informed, cooperated fully with the attorney's requests, horrified to learn the extent of what she'd unknowingly been part of. The marriage unraveled within the month, filed as an annulment on grounds of fraud rather than a standard divorce, a distinction Bartholomew explained would matter significantly for how any future custody questions were handled once the baby arrived. My mother called me sobbing, not in sympathy for what I'd uncovered, but in disbelief that any of it could be true, and it took several conversations before she stopped defending Inez long enough to actually read the documents I sent her. My father didn't speak to me for nearly 2 weeks, not out of anger exactly, but out of the particular silence of a man trying to figure out how he'd missed something that big under his own roof for so long. Inez never faced criminal charges, since surrogacy deception occupies a murky legal space that Bartholomew described as more civil than criminal in most jurisdictions. But the annulment stripped her of any financial claim to Desmond's assets, and the story, once it reached the wider family, stripped her of something she seemed to value even more, the golden reputation she'd spent a lifetime curating. When the baby was born 11 weeks later, a healthy girl named after nobody in either family, Desmond chose, after long consideration and several conversations with Bartholomew about his options, not to pursue parental rights, a decision that broke something in him even as it freed him.